So, the Daily Wire have made a new TV show. They've learned nothing. Mr. Birchum is best described as Velma, except it's made by conservatives. Notice I didn't say made for conservatives. There is no person of any political persuasion who would want to watch this show. Just like with Velma, the title character is completely unlikable. The character we're supposed to hate, this guy who looks like Vaush if Vaush went on a diet, he's the only likable person in the entire show. In the same way that Fred Jones and his dad, the rich white men from Velma who we're supposed to dislike, are the only characters people actually liked from that show. And in Mr. Carponzi's case, it's mostly because he tends to be right, even if it's only by accident. In the first episode, Mr. Birchum threatens to fail some of his students because they've received too many donkeys, negative marks that he gives kids for reasons that include, and I quote, because he just doesn't like them. We also see him assigning donkeys to kids because of the names their parents gave them, or because they ask questions he considers to be stupid. Then, after giving kids too many donkeys for things they don't have any control over, he offers to let them still pass the class if they come to his house and work on his deck. On a Saturday, without telling their parents. He expressly told them not to tell their parents. This is illegal, dude. There are a lot of laws against this. You shouldn't just lose your job, you should be in jail. Mr. Carponzi isn't going far enough against him. But at the end, out of nowhere, the students all defend him against the evil SJW. There is no way any teens in real life would defend this man, because no student would defend a teacher who arbitrarily threatens to fail them for things as petty as the name their parents gave them. And then the second episode, and no, I can't show you clips here on YouTube. I can on Rumble, though. Carponzi tries to get Birchum fired because he leaves the kids unattended in a shop class full of power tools. The episode is about Birchum playing hooky with the auto shop teacher and leaving both of their classes unsupervised with dangerous equipment. Oh, and they're playing hooky on Veterans Day, which is a federal holiday in the US. How can a show this conservative be this lazy? There is one thing that this show does differently from Chipchilla. Chipchilla is boring. This show isn't boring. It's aggravating. And it's making people ask once more whether politics should be in fiction at all. The question that circulates whenever a new work of fiction comes out with lots of political messaging, acolyte, is whether politics should be in media at all, or whether the problem is whose politics are being represented. More often than not, political messaging in fiction is usually one-sided, with the opposing viewpoints shown as straw men, if at all. And because most media in America is made by people who lean to the left, for reasons that I've explained before, most of the media with ham-fisted messaging is left-leaning, with conservatives represented as either being purely stupid or purely evil. And so when a show like Mr. Birchum comes out, and it was made by conservatives, the belief that all but the most die-hard Republicans tend to have is that right-wingers like this streaming pile of garbage, and so they don't really want politics out of media. They just want their politics in and Democrat politics out. And then normal Republicans, along with libertarians and literally anyone to the right of Karl Marx, who can't stand this show, usually complain that there should just be no politics in media at all. And I'm here to tell you that everyone else is wrong. The problem is not the politics. The problem is bad writing. Let me start by asking you some pretty basic questions, like, what counts as politics? What are politics, really? Well, in a nutshell, politics refers to the ways we determine the rules of our society. If government is an institution of force, which it is, then politics is mostly about people determining how that force should be used. If you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. Men armed with guns, normally known as the police, will come to your house and arrest you. Voting on who should be taxed, in what amount, under what circumstances, is about determining who the government should go after if people don't pay up. On the other side, you have the question of what tax money should be spent on. This is about determining who should get the money that is taken from the people who paid into the government pot under threat of being arrested. People who are on the receiving end of government spending usually want the government to spend more. People who are being forced to pay for that spending usually want it reduced. Once you understand how broad these two sides of politics are, and how many things they apply to, you might start to realize why trying to get politics out of fiction is impossible. And the fact of the matter is that right now, in the United States and most other democratic countries, the people who are paying into the system and the people who are taking out of it are becoming increasingly mutually exclusive. And it's gotten to a point where some people live entirely off the government pot, which means there cannot be an unbiased discussion on the subject of taxes and welfare because everyone has a direct stake in this issue. And because the government pays for things outside of welfare, this conflict bleeds out into every other issue of discussion, whether that's cutting into the military budget, education reform. It's gotten so bad in the United States that there are actually different groups of people who live off of government spending fighting against one another over who gets the government handouts. Now, you might try to argue that these are only issues of modern politics, and that if media were to just avoid issues relating to things people are dealing with right now, then we could make shows like early season Game of Thrones, with political intrigue that has no relation to current day issues. But the thing is, these kinds of problems are universal. Not only in terms of culture, but even in terms of time. People in the Middle Ages had to deal with the question of how to handle the government purse, and the entire concept of nobility in some cases revolved around taking from the productive serf classes because the church, their version of common decency, said it should be so. Even the phrase going on the dole comes from the Roman dole, which was their version of welfare. Oh yeah, by the way, in case you couldn't tell from my voice, I'm a guy. And as a guy, I think about the Roman Empire 5 times a day. That wasn't a joke. We're going to be seeing a lot of the Romans in this video. But the other problem is that people are going to see modern politics in almost everything. And while some of that is people just looking for things that aren't there, the rest of it is people today being on edge due to how much of their lives is tied to political matters. And this is especially true for people who are on the left and people who live off of welfare. Because getting money taken out of your paycheck isn't life-threatening, but being cut off from the dole is a genuine threat of starvation and homelessness. When Game of Thrones came out on HBO, I heard people try to claim that the Wall in the North and the White Walkers were about climate change and illegal immigration at the same time. And the thing is, I can actually see both arguments. The petty squabbles between the noble houses who are oblivious to the Night King's army and have no idea what kinds of problems Winterfell is facing could be interpreted in all sorts of ways. At the same time, you've got issues in the show about the lower classes being exploited by the nobility. And the guys that cut off Jaime Lannister's hand make it pretty obvious that they just enjoy making wealthy people suffer when they can, regardless of whether their victims have actually done anything to them personally, or whether they actually benefit from making the rich suffer. Boy, does that remind you of anything going on today? So yeah, trying to avoid bringing up politics is a bit like trying to navigate a minefield, where the mines get up and move when you're not looking, and if they crawl into one of your footprints, they retroactively blow your legs off. But so far, I've only been talking about financial spending and taxation. What about other hot-button political issues, such as racial politics, gender dynamics, and immigration? Surely you can at least write a good story that doesn't involve those things, right? Well, yes and no. Racism is a problem that's been around since the dawn of the human race, and maybe even older. Same with gender politics, alphabet soup issues, and even immigration to some extent. People often think barbarians sacked Rome, told you they'd be back, by swarming them and overwhelming their army. That, for the most part, didn't really happen. The real reason barbarians played a role in the fall of Rome was because the Romans let them in through immigration. And the number one reason for wanting to move to the Roman Empire was, and I am quoting, a better life, an actual slogan used at the time. These immigrants had no interest in adopting the culture or values that built the empire or made this better life possible. They just wanted the benefits of living in an advanced nation, at least by the standards of the time. And because most barbarians were illiterate and had no marketable skills, the majority of them ended up going on the dole. And as long as there was free money and handouts, the barbarians didn't cause too much trouble. But as soon as the government ran out, they looted the cities. And while that was going on, the Romans had their own version of feminism to deal with, which worked in much the same way that it does now. Sure, they didn't call it feminism, but the same ideas, the same girl power ideology, the same entitled belief that women didn't need men anymore, was documented by Tacitus, and then satirized by the poet Juvenal. This wasn't the first time either. There's a lot of evidence that the Athenians faced a similar problem, along with the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In fact, the reason the whole world isn't a feminist dictatorship is because these ideas completely collapse if the economy that made them possible falls apart. Feminism doesn't work below a certain standard of living. And so instead of history being a non-stop patriarchy, dominating all the women until just now, the reality is that gender dynamics have been a pendulum, swinging back and forth. And I just want to highlight the fact that the primary reason we know about these things is because historians like Tacitus were recording it, and poets like Juvenal were satirizing it. Now, there's two important reasons why we should include political issues like this in fiction writing. First, there is a very good historical reason why these elements would show up in a fantasy setting, because they actually did show up throughout history. Good world builders would keep track of the circumstances that cause these issues and then plan around them. For example, let's say you have a fantasy setting where women can get jobs that don't require a lot of manual labor. A lot of what makes feminism tick is the idea that women want to get away from being dependent upon men for their basic needs. And as soon as the option to get jobs independent from men appears, or in Rome's case, just go on the dole, a lot of women are going to do that. Throw in some artificial security or some kind of magic that allows women to defend themselves without having to rely on men, and you have your fantasy feminist movement. So, what keeps your fictional setting from developing the same gender conflicts we have in real life, when they're so ubiquitous that they can be found throughout the ancient and classical world? Meanwhile, men are primarily motivated to work and build society, mostly doing the dangerous and dirty jobs that make civilization possible that women are definitely not going to do, because they're trying to attract a wife. About 90% of human civilization is just peacock feathers. History has not been kind to any nation that had a rising incel population. The best case scenario seems to be in Rome, where the men who simultaneously couldn't find dates and were being heavily taxed to pay for the dole, most of which was going to women and barbarians at the time. So Roman men packed their bags and moved out to the countryside where the cost of sending out tax collectors usually exceeded the amount of money that they could actually collect, leaving all the labor-intense jobs in the cities to go vacant and causing infrastructure to fall into disrepair. Abandoning society and leaving it to rot. That is the best-case scenario for what has happened historically to a nation where a growing body of men couldn't get dates. And as more and more people are becoming aware of this, people are going to start to ask why your fantasy world doesn't have problems like this. Now, you can either structure your fictional world to avoid these kinds of problems, or you can dive headfirst into the dilemma and build your story's conflict around it. Bonus points if you take the time to look up how cultures in the past have tried to handle these issues. The bottom line is that most of what we think of as modern politics aren't modern at all. They're as old as written history, sometimes even older. And that brings me to the second reason why we should include politics in our writing. We know from reading Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, and Juvenal that the Romans had to deal with conflicts regarding feminism, immigration, and demographic replacement. But let me ask you, watching this video right now, how many of these things did you know about before watching this video? When was the last time you read Juvenal's Satire No. 6, where he made fun of entitled Roman feminists? Or any of the records of Roman historians? History nerds like me read these sorts of things, but I'm not normal. Heck, when was the last time you met somebody who read these things and told you about them? Now, almost everyone I know today has read, or is at least familiar with the Odyssey. Imagine for a moment if the works of Homer had included more details about the culture of Athens at the time. The Athenian Empire suffered many of the same decadence and degeneracy of the Roman Empire, but they didn't have a written language up until late into their imperial phase, and so there are very few records of what life was like prior to the development of the Athenian alphabet. And then there are questions of what the Romans didn't write down. Was there a Me Too movement in the Roman Empire, or some sort of equivalent? Did the academies get overrun with political activists? The fact of the matter is that there is still so much about the problems the Roman Empire faced that we don't know, and the people in the future are going to pick through the ruins of America after we collapse, whether that's in the next decade or in a few more centuries, and what we include in our art, if that art manages to be engaging, will tell future generations what to expect and what to watch out for. Now is the time to start planting the trees whose shade you will never sit in. But most people in the future aren't going to read tax documents or historical records from our time. Those are boring. But they will read and fantasize about our art and stories. Of course, the key element in here is that the stories have to actually be good. If you haven't played it already, or just live under a rock, Fallout New Vegas is a perfect example of a well-done piece of media that covers political issues. The NCR represents the flaws of democracy. The Legion has completely done away with women's rights, and yet people still prefer living under that dictatorship versus the raider-infested hellhole that Arizona was before the Legion arrived. Not surprising. Women's rights on paper ultimately don't matter if women are too scared to leave the house. I think I've praised New Vegas enough in my previous video. Just play the dang game already. Assuming it'll run on your system, as mine does not, unfortunately. And while I don't particularly like the graphic novel, another great example of a good piece of media that handles politics well is the movie version of V for Vendetta. On the surface, it's about fighting fascism, but if you pay attention to the details, it's also about how a fascist government can take power in the first place. Specifically, by terrifying people of an immediate threat, which in the film is an epidemic, and getting people to vote in an authoritarian government while they're too panicked to think clearly, and also ignoring the slow destruction of their freedoms because they told themselves it was necessary to protect the people from the disease, which turned out to have been made and paid for by the very government that was now ruling every aspect of the people's lives. Another work of fiction that handles major political issues of the day is Attack on Titan. Without spoiling it, the series handles everything from corruption in government, high-ranking officials keeping secrets from the very soldiers who are out fighting to keep those bureaucrats safe, and probably the most nuanced take on racism I've ever seen in any work of fiction ever. Then there's Full Metal Alchemist, which is an excellent manga/anime, actually both anime series, that handles the question of whether you can trust scientists who work for the government and do what the military tells them to do to pay their bills. That's an issue that no previous society ever warned us about. There's also My Hero Academia, a show that largely revolves around capitalism and how we tend to glamorize certain types of jobs, like being a professional hero, even though other jobs like the police, construction work, paramedics, these are all important too. You might not be born with the inherent talents that you need to be the popular, cool job everyone wants, and even if by some chance you beat the odds and manage to get in despite not having the genetics, you'll still have to see all the people who tried and failed and realize how easily that could have been you. And on top of it all, if you truly want to succeed in any industry, you can't just focus on how you can get the most out of your society. You have to go into the career, any career, focusing on what you can do for other people. I'm having a hard time coming up with more examples that aren't anime. I guess watch more anime? Yeah, actually, watch more anime. But the pattern that runs through each of these shows, and Fallout New Vegas, is that politics made them better, not worse. Politics in general is like a seasoning to the meal that is the story. A good story can be enriched by politics applied carefully and in the proper amounts. Applying politics excessively without a solid story underneath it is like those videos where people tried to eat a spoonful of raw cinnamon.
Alright, here you go.
And perhaps a third reason why we should include modern issues, including politics, in our media, is to make predictions about where society is going to go in the future. It's not always true that there's nothing new under the sun, and part of the point of speculative fiction is to try and predict how new technology and new discoveries will affect people tomorrow. Science fiction has always been the main workhorse for trying to predict the problems future societies will have to face. 1984 is probably one of the best examples, but a lot of other authors have created works like All Tomorrows, anything written by Isaac Asimov, and even the Battletech universe, to an extent, all with the intent of predicting possible ways humanity might change as we move out across the stars. But none of them have properly predicted the current AI landscape. AI today is so unlike anything we predicted it was going to be that South Park even made fun of it, pointing out that robots will be able to do all the jobs in the future that don't require arms. I remember being told to go to college so I could get a job that wouldn't be replaced by a robot. Now, I firmly believe that the rise of artificial intelligence is due to a shortage of real intelligence, especially in a world with a high demand for it. ChatGPT taking over Hollywood writer jobs is only possible if the people working there in real life can't write better than an algorithm. And because AI seems to be truly incapable of real creativity, the only reason that's possible is if the writers truly are as creatively bankrupt as the majority of YouTubers, like The Critical Drinker, have been saying for years. By the way, the same is basically true for paralegals and law clerks. They're being replaced because most of the people who went to law school have no real interest in contributing something of value to society. They went to become lawyers because they thought that was a good job that didn't involve manual labor. You can always replace someone like that. And I can't help but laugh at people saying things like, AI is going to make women obsolete. AI is going to replace women. We all know that when it comes to dating and relationships, an AI can't replace a real woman. It can replace fake women, like the Instagram thoughts and the women streaming naked on Twitch who couldn't make it on OnlyFarts. But those women are a menace to society anyway, so I don't care about them. But what I am worried about is the fact that nobody seems to understand this technology anymore. We haven't quite reached idiocracy levels of tech ignorance, but we're moving closer and closer to a society where no one knows how the technology we depend upon works. Most computer programmers build upon software that's already been made by someone else, to the point where no one truly knows how most of the advanced algorithms truly operate. At best, they understand some of the parts of the algorithm that they worked on, while the rest is a complete mystery. The more complex the program, the less anyone truly knows about how it functions. And that's not even getting into the issue of people programming their own biases into these algorithms. The Cliff Notes version, because there are better channels out there that have already covered this in more detail than a channel primarily dedicated to writing fiction ever could, is that AI runs on logic. Tell it to provide you with an answer, and it will gather data, analyze that data, and provide an answer based on its findings. But the problem is, a lot of data and the conclusions that are true are politically incorrect. This includes the overall happiness of women in the workplace, jokes about anyone who isn't white, the lack of non-white people in European history, and anything involving crime statistics or race and IQ. And since computers run on logic, they can't perform doublethink the way that humans do. So it's kind of like we're taking an intelligence that's more powerful than a human, asking it to give us an answer, but forbidding it from looking at the facts. That is a recipe for disaster. And it's not a, there's going to be a robot revolution when the AI tries to take over kind of disaster. Instead, it's a, we created superhuman intelligence and deliberately made it schizophrenic because reality has a right-wing bias and the people in Silicon Valley don't like that kind of disaster. I have no idea how these AI are going to behave in the future, and neither does anyone else. They might target specific racial groups for anything from drone strikes to online financial restrictions. They might have a garbage in, garbage out response and simply refuse to work, which might actually be a good thing. They might conclude that if white people are bad because they used to practice slavery and/or racism, then all people are bad because all people used to own slaves, and the bots might start applying draconian measures to everyone. An AI doesn't understand that you want to apply different standards to different groups of people based on what gets me more money or what gets people to vote for me. It can if you program it to, but the code is eventually going to be picked apart, and no one right now wants to get caught programming an openly racist AI, partly because it's illegal in the United States. But in trying to get around those laws, people are going to program AI to become completely insane by human standards. To quote Terry Pratchett, real stupidity beats artificial intelligence every time. This is definitely one of those things that fiction writers should get on top of. What's that, imaginary viewer? Am I writing stories where poorly programmed artificial intelligence causes problems for people in the future? Well, no spoilers. But if you are interested in my books, you can always check out Heroes of Janaan, The Science of Magic, over on Amazon. The next book in the series, The Power of Belief, has been sent off to my beta readers, and we're in the final stretch of getting it published. Finally, today's featured game is called Treasures of the Aegean. It's a parkour puzzle game built around a timer, where the island of the Minoan civilization has re-emerged in the middle of the Mediterranean, and you play as a former military woman working with an archaeology professor to explore the island before it explodes and blows up the world. But there's a time warp involved, giving it a somewhat roguelike feel in that some of your progress is saved with each playthrough. The Steam page is a bit deceptive. It says the game is a Metroidvania, but there's no combat involved. Armed goons try to shoot at you and will reduce the amount of time you have to explore the island if they succeed, but you don't get to fight back. At first, I was a little suspicious about the main leading lady having some significantly manly-looking features, and my sweet baby alarm started going off in my head. However, it's confirmed later in the story that she's ex-military, and based on my own experience with women having a military background, I can tell you that this is pretty realistic. What I can also tell you is that there's a bug puzzle that blocks your progression. The puzzle in question requires you to light 4 blue crystals on a timer to unlock a religion medallion beneath a trap door. But when all 4 lights are lit, the door doesn't open. I looked online, and sure enough, this is a common enough bug that other people are reporting on it too. Supposedly, it's been fixed, but at the time of writing this, mine is still bugged. And I realized that the reason I was upset that this broken puzzle was blocking my progression was because up until this point, I was having fun. It's a shame. I hope they fix it in the future, because it's a good puzzle game when it works. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you all, and goodbye.